Now, let's begin. The summer heat pressed down on the small Montana town of Silver Ridge like a heavy blanket. Garrett McGee stood behind the counter of his diner, a converted rail car from the 1950s that sat on the edge of Main Street, watching his sister Sharon refill the coffee for Norman Cochran, one of their regulars. The old mechanic had been coming here every morning for the past 3 years, ever since Garrett bought the place with his discharge money and what little he'd saved from 18 years in the Army. "You gonna add more tables outside, Garrett?" Norman asked, pointing his fork at him. Summer crowds picking up. Garrett shook his head, wiping down the already clean counter. "Don't need the hassle. We do fine with what we got." Sharon caught his eye and smiled. She'd been working here since the beginning, since the day Garrett had asked her to leave her abusive ex-husband Dave Fuller in Billings and start fresh. That was 2 years ago. She'd shown up with a black eye, a duffel bag, and enough determination to rebuild her life that Garrett knew she'd make it. Now she was saving money, taking online courses, laughing again. The diner had given them both something they'd needed. Purpose without the weight of their past pressing down on them. "Table 4 needs more syrup," Sharon called out, already moving toward the kitchen. Garrett grabbed the bottle and headed over. The breakfast rush was winding down, leaving just Norman and a young couple from out of town who were studying a roadmap between bites of pancakes. This was how Garrett liked it. Quiet, predictable, peaceful. After what he'd done for 18 years, after the things he'd seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and places that didn't make the news, peace was a gift he didn't take for granted. The bell above the door chimed. Garrett looked up and felt his jaw tighten. 3 men walked in, their leather cuts marking them as bikers. The patches showed a grinning skull with the words "Devil's Disciples MC" arched above it. Garrett had seen them around town the past few weeks, mostly at the bar down the street, but they'd never come in here. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and cold eyes that swept the room like he was assessing territory. Behind him came 2 younger ones, both carrying themselves with the kind of swagger that came from running in a pack. "Help you, gentlemen?" Garrett asked, his voice neutral. The bearded one, Randolph Hall, according to the name patch on his cut, slid onto a stool at the counter. His friends flanked him. "Coffee. Black." Sharon was already reaching for cups, but Garrett raised a hand. "I got it." He poured 3 cups and set them down. Randolph took a sip, made a face, and pushed it away. "Tastes like shit." "Then don't drink it," Garrett said evenly. Randolph's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Norman spoke up from his booth. "Coffee's fine. Been drinking it 3 years." "Nobody asked you, old man." One of the younger bikers, Brent Henderson, based on his patch, snapped. Norman's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Garrett saw the fear flicker across the mechanic's face and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen this before, predators testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. "Brent, is it?" Garrett said quietly. "You're welcome to leave if you don't like the coffee." Randolph laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Relax, brother. We're just passing through. Heard you used to be military." "That true." "Used to be," Garrett confirmed. "What branch?" "Army." "Doing what?" Garrett met his eyes. "This and that." Randolph studied him for a long moment, then drained his coffee in one gulp despite his earlier complaint. "Well, Army, maybe you can spread the word. Devil's Disciples are going to be around Silver Ridge for a while. We bought the old Morrison property out by the lake. Gonna make it our clubhouse." He dropped $1 on the counter, half what the coffee cost. "We like to be friendly with the locals. Long as the locals stay friendly with us." They left without another word. Garrett watched them climb onto their bikes, 3 Harley-Davidsons that roared to life and rumbled down Main Street. Sharon came up beside him, her arms crossed. "I don't like them," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Garrett replied. "But they haven't done anything yet." "Yet," Sharon echoed. Norman cleared his throat. "I heard they caused some trouble down in Wyoming. Our fight, I think. Sent 2 guys to the hospital." Garrett nodded slowly. He'd heard the same thing. The Devil's Disciples had a reputation: drug trafficking, extortion, violence. They were a 1% club, the kind that gave all bikers a bad name. And now they were setting up shop in Silver Ridge, a town with a population of barely 3,000 and a police force consisting of Sheriff Eduardo Norman and 2 deputies. "If they come back, you call me," Norman said, standing up and putting on his cap. "I mean it, Garrett. I'll round up some boys from the VFW. We don't need this kind of trouble here." "Won't come to that," Garrett assured him, but even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. The next 2 weeks passed without incident, but Garrett felt the tension building like a storm on the horizon. The Devil's Disciples were everywhere, at the gas station, the grocery store, the bar. They rode through town in packs, their engines deliberately loud, their presence a constant reminder that the balance of Silver Ridge had shifted. Garrett heard stories. Cassie Sellers, who ran the convenience store, said they'd stolen beer and laughed when she threatened to call the cops. Jordan McIntyre, one of the deputies, told him they'd found drugs at the old Morrison place, but couldn't get a warrant without more evidence. Sharon grew quieter. Garrett noticed her watching the street more often, flinching when motorcycles roared past. One evening, as they were closing up, she finally spoke. "I'm scared, Garrett." He stopped counting the register and looked at her. "Of them." She nodded. "I see the way they look at me when I'm walking to my car. Like Dave used to look at me. Before things got bad." Garrett's hands tightened on the stack of bills. Dave Fuller. He'd wanted to kill that man when Sharon showed up with bruises on her ribs and a split lip. Would have, if Sharon hadn't begged him not to. She'd wanted to leave that life behind, not give Dave the satisfaction of destroying another piece of her by turning her brother into a murderer. "They won't touch you," Garrett said, his voice hard. "I promise you that." "You can't promise that," Sharon whispered. "There's 50 of them now. More arriving every day. And you're just..." "I'm just what?" She looked at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "You're just one man, Garrett. What are you going to do against 50 bikers?" He wanted to tell her the truth, that he wasn't just one man, that he'd been Staff Sergeant Garrett McGee, 7th Special Forces Group, that he'd spent 5 years as a hand-to-hand combat instructor at Fort Bragg teaching soldiers how to kill efficiently with their bare hands. He wanted to tell her about the times he'd cleared rooms full of enemy combatants, about the night in Kandahar when his team was ambushed and he'd fought off 8 Taliban fighters with nothing but a knife and his training. But he'd left that man behind when he bought this diner. He'd buried him deep, promised himself he'd never dig him up again. "Nothing's going to happen," he said instead. "Trust me." But 3 days later, everything changed. It was a Friday night, the diner's busiest time. Sharon was handling the dining room while Garrett manned the grill, flipping burgers and calling out orders. They had maybe 15 customers, families, couples, a few solo diners reading newspapers. The summer evening was cooling off, and through the open windows Garrett could hear kids playing in the park across the street. Then he heard the motorcycles. Not just 3 or 4 this time. The sound was like thunder, a rolling wave that grew louder and louder until it felt like it was shaking the walls. Garrett looked up from the grill and saw them pulling into the parking lot. 20, 30, 40 bikes, maybe more. They filled every space, spilled out onto the street, their riders dismounting and converging on the diner's entrance like a black leather tide. The door opened. Randolph Hall walked in first, followed by Brent Henderson and another man Garrett didn't recognize. A heavy-set biker with a scarred face and dead eyes. Behind them came more and more, until the diner was packed with Devil's Disciples. They filled the booths, crowded around the counter, leaned against the walls. The families and couples looked terrified. One father grabbed his young daughter and hurried toward the door, but 2 bikers blocked his path, grinning. "Where you going?" one asked. "Party's just getting started." "Let them leave," Garrett said, his voice cutting through the noise. Everyone turned to look at him. "Anyone who wants to leave, you let them leave." "Now," Randolph studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure, Army. We're not monsters." He gestured toward the door. "Any civilians want to go. We just want to enjoy this fine establishment." The families fled. Within 2 minutes, the diner was empty except for Sharon, Garrett, and approximately 50 Devil's Disciples. Sharon stood frozen near table 6, her order pad clutched in white-knuckled hands. Garrett met her eyes across the room and saw the terror there. And something inside him, something he'd kept locked away for 3 years, began to wake up. "Now then," Randolph said, settling onto a stool. We're hungry. Start cooking, Army. We want steaks, eggs, burgers, fries, everything you got. And bring us some beers. Don't serve alcohol, Garrett said. Then we'll provide our own. Randolph nodded to Brent, who went outside and returned with several cases of beer. They cracked them open, passing bottles around, their laughter growing louder. Garrett looked at Sharon. Kitchen. Now. She moved quickly, slipping past bikers who deliberately didn't move out of her way, forcing her to squeeze between them. Garrett followed, his mind already working through the situation. 50 men, all of them violent criminals. No clear exit strategy. The phone was behind the counter. He could maybe reach it, call Jordan, but the deputies would take 15 minutes to get here. And that was if they came at all. These weren't odds anyone sane would take. But Garrett had never claimed to be sane. In the kitchen, Sharon grabbed his arm. What are we going to do? Cook, Garrett said. Do exactly what they say. Keep your head down. Garrett, trust me, he said, and squeezed her hand. They cooked. For the next 30 minutes, they worked the grill and fryer, producing plate after plate of food that the bikers devoured like locusts. They were loud, crude, breaking dishes and spilling beer on the floors Garrett had mopped that afternoon. Randolph held court from his stool, telling stories about fights they'd won, people they'd hurt, crimes they'd gotten away with. The scar biker, Terrence Bauer, Garrett heard someone call him, kept watching Sharon with eyes that made Garrett's skin crawl. Then Sharon carried a tray of burgers out to table 8, and Terrence grabbed her wrist. Hey, sweetheart, he said, his breath reeking of beer. Why don't you sit down? Take a load off. I'm working, Sharon said, trying to pull away. His grip tightened. I'm saying you should sit down. Let go of her, Garrett said from behind the counter. Terrence looked up, grinning. Or what, Army? You gonna make me? Garrett started walking toward them. Several bikers stood up, blocking his path. Randolph raised a hand. Easy, everyone. This is a friendly gathering. He looked at Terrence. Let the girl go. We're here for the food, not the help. Terrence released Sharon's wrist, but not before running his thumb across her palm in a way that made her flinch. She hurried back to the kitchen, and Garrett forced himself to return to the counter. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. Old instincts were flooding back. Threat assessment, target prioritization, battlefield awareness. He was cataloging everything. How many men were armed, most of them probably who looked trained, a handful at most. Where the exits were front door, back door, through the kitchen windows. What weapons were available? Knives in the kitchen, a baseball bat under the counter, his bare hands. Another 20 minutes passed. The bikers grew drunker and louder. Garrett saw Sharon carrying more plates out, saw the way they looked at her, heard their crude comments. She kept her eyes down, kept moving, but he could see her hands shaking. Then Terrence stood up as she passed and slapped her across the backside. Sharon dropped the plates. They shattered on the floor. She spun around, her face flushed with humiliation and rage, and slapped Terrence across the face. The diner went silent. Terrence touched his cheek, his expression darkening. Then he lunged forward and grabbed Sharon by the throat, slamming her against the wall. She gasped, clawing at his hands. You bitch, Terrence snarled. Nobody hits me. Nobody. Garrett was moving before he realized it. He vaulted over the counter, crossed the room in 3 strides, and drove his fist into Terrence's kidney with enough force to drop most men. Terrence grunted and released Sharon, who crumpled to the floor, gasping. Bikers were shouting, standing up, reaching for weapons. Garrett stepped between them and his sister, his whole body coiled like a spring. Randolph Hall stood up slowly from his stool. The room quieted again. He walked over, his boots crunching on broken plates, and looked down at Sharon, then at Garrett. Well, Army, he said softly. Looks like we got ourselves a situation. Take your boys and leave, Garrett said. Right now. While you still can. Randolph laughed, that gravel in a blender sound, and several bikers joined in. Or what? You gonna take us all on? He stepped closer, close enough that Garrett could smell the beer on his breath. What are you gonna do, old man? Garrett looked at Sharon, still on the floor, a red mark blooming on her throat where Terrence had grabbed her. He looked at the bikers, all 50 of them, crowding his diner, destroying his peace, hurting his family. He thought about Dave Fuller and every other man who'd ever hurt someone weaker. He He thought about the promises he'd made to himself about leaving violence behind. Then he walked to the front door, locked it, and flipped the open sign to closed. The bikers watched him, some confused, some still laughing. Randolph's smile faded slightly. Garrett turned around, standing in front of the only exit, and looked at Randolph Hall. "I'm not locked in here with you," he said quietly. "You're locked in here with me." For just a moment, one brief, beautiful moment, Garrett saw understanding dawn in Randolph's eyes. Saw him realize that he'd made a terrible, fatal mistake. Then Garrett moved. He'd learned hand-to-hand combat from Master Sergeant William Chun, who'd learned it from Israeli Krav Maga instructors, who'd learned it from actual combat experience fighting enemies who wanted to kill them. The first principle, there are no rules in a real fight. The second principle, end it as quickly as possible. The third principle, if you're going to fight, fight to win. Garrett hit Randolph first. Not a movie punch to the jaw, but a palm strike to the nose that sent cartilage and bone fragments into his sinus cavity. Randolph went down hard, blood spraying, and didn't get up. Before anyone could react, Garrett had grabbed Brent Henderson by the collar, drove his knee in the man's groin, and when Brent doubled over, brought his elbow down on the back of his skull. 2 down. The diner erupted in chaos. Bikers surged toward him from all sides, shouting and swinging. Garrett moved like water, letting his training take over. A biker came at him with a beer bottle. Garrett sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, twisted until he heard bones snap, and drove the broken bottle into another attacker's shoulder. Someone grabbed him from behind in a bear hug. Garrett dropped his weight, drove his heel into the man's instep, then snapped his head backward into the man's face. The hold loosened. Garrett spun, delivered a knife-hand strike to the throat, watched the biker collapse, clutching his crushed larynx. 6 down. A chair flew at his head. Garrett ducked, felt it whistle past, heard it crash into another biker. Good. Let them hurt each other. He grabbed a table, flipped it onto its side, used it as a shield to push forward into the mass of bodies. Someone stabbed at him with a knife. Garrett caught the wrist, twisted the arm behind the attacker's back until the shoulder dislocated, took the knife, and drove it into the wooden tabletop. Let them see he didn't need weapons. 10 down. More were coming from the booths, the bathroom, outside. They'd realized this wasn't just a fight. This was a slaughter. But they kept coming anyway, because that's what pack animals did. They relied on numbers, on overwhelming force. They'd never fought someone for whom numbers didn't matter. Garrett had cleared houses in Fallujah with 4 operators against 20 enemy combatants. He'd held a position in Helmand province for 6 hours against waves of Taliban fighters. This was just another Tuesday. A heavy-set biker swung a baseball bat at his head. Garrett dove inside the swing, took the impact on his shoulder. It would bruise, might crack, but bones could be ignored, and drove his fingers into the biker's eyes. The man screamed and dropped the bat. Garrett caught it, spun, and used it like a staff, sweeping legs, striking kneecaps, ribs, skulls. The aluminum bat rang, with each impact like a church bell. 17 down. Blood on the floor now, making it slippery. Garrett used that. Let his momentum carry him into slides and rolls that kept him moving, kept him from being pinned down. A biker tried to tackle him. Garrett turned at the last second, used the man's momentum to throw him through the front window. Glass shattered. An alarm started wailing. Good. Maybe someone would call the cops. 23 down. His knuckles were split and bleeding. His shoulder was definitely fractured. 1, I was swelling shut from a punch that had gotten through his guard. Didn't matter. Pain was just information. He compartmentalized it, locked it away in the same place he'd locked away the man he used to be. Terrence Bauer charged him with a knife, the blade seeking his kidneys. Garrett caught Terrence's wrist with his left hand, trapped the arm, and drove a right hook into the man's temple. Terrence's eyes rolled back. Garrett stripped the knife, dropped Terrence, and kept moving. 30 down. The remaining 20 were backing away now, realizing too late what they'd walked into. But the door was still locked, and Garrett was between them and freedom. Some were trying the windows. One smashed through and started climbing out. Garrett let him go. Let them tell the story. Let them spread the word about what happened when you hurt his family. A biker pulled a gun, a small revolver, probably a .38. Garrett was on him before he could aim, trapped the gun hand, twisted until he felt the wrist snap, took the gun, and used it as a blunt instrument against the next attacker's temple. He didn't fire it. Didn't need to. Gunshots would complicate things with the police. 35 down. Sharon was screaming something from the kitchen, but Garrett couldn't hear her over the blood pounding in his ears. He was in the zone now, that place where time slowed down and everything became clear and simple. Threat. Neutralize. Next threat. Neutralize. Over and over until there were no more threats. The last 15 rushed him all at once, a desperate final surge. Garrett met them head-on. He took hits, a broken rib, maybe two, a gash above his eyebrow that sent blood streaming into his eyes, but he gave back more than he took. Elbows, knees, headbutts, throws. He used their own bodies as weapons, slamming them into each other, into tables, into walls. The diner was a wreck now. Furniture destroyed, blood everywhere, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above it all, indifferent to the carnage below. And then, suddenly it was over. Garrett stood in the center of the diner, surrounded by broken bodies. Some were unconscious. Some were moaning, clutching broken bones and bleeding wounds. A few had made it out the windows. None were standing. He looked down at his hands, bloody, swollen, shaking with adrenaline. The old man was back. The one he'd tried to bury. The one who knew how to survive when survival meant violence. Sharon emerged from the kitchen, her phone in her hand. "I call 911, she whispered. "Garrett, what did you do?" "What I had to," he said, and then the adrenaline crashed and he sat down hard on the floor. They sat together in the wreckage, Sharon crying quietly, Garrett staring at nothing, until the first police sirens wailed in the distance. Jordan McIntyre would arrive in exactly 12 minutes, his service weapon drawn, expecting a hostage situation or a massacre. What he'd find instead was 50 bikers down and Garrett McGee sitting in the middle of them, blood dripping from his split knuckles onto the floor while the ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The only thing moving in the Silver Ridge diner was the ceiling fan. Deputy Jordan McIntyre had been on the force for 6 years, and in those 6 years he'd responded to exactly 2 violent crimes, both bar fights that ended before he arrived. Nothing had prepared him for what he saw when he and Deputy Melanie Cruz pulled up to the Silver Ridge diner with lights flashing and weapons drawn. The front window was shattered. Blood smeared the glass. Motorcycles sat abandoned in the parking lot like a steel graveyard. Through the broken window, Jordan could see bodies, lots of them. Jesus Christ. Melanie breathed beside him. Call for backup. All of it. EMTs, state police, everyone. Jordan was already on the radio, his voice shaking as he requested assistance. They approached carefully, covering each other, not sure what they'd find inside. A mass shooting? A bomb? Some kind of gang war? What they found was Garrett McGee sitting cross-legged on the floor, his sister Sharon beside him with her arms around him. Surrounding them were 50 Devils Disciples members in various states of consciousness and injury. Jordan saw broken bones, blood, unconscious men, and in the center of it all, Garrett, beaten and bloody, but very much alive. "Don't move!" Jordan shouted, his gun trained on Garrett. Garrett looked up slowly. His left eye was swollen shut, blood dripped from a cut above his eyebrow, and his hands looked like ground meat. But his voice was calm when he spoke. "Not going anywhere, Jordan. What the hell happened here?" Sharon answered, her voice hoarse. "They attacked us. 50 of them. He protected me." Jordan stared at the carnage around them. 50 men. One Garrett McGee. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. "Garrett McGee, you need to stand up slowly and put your hands behind your head," Jordan said, following procedure even though nothing about this situation was in any procedure manual he'd ever read. Garrett complied, wincing as his broken ribs protested. Jordan cuffed him, more for show than anything else, because if Garrett wanted to resist, Jordan had just seen evidence that no amount of backup would help. They led him outside, just as more patrol cars arrived, along with 3 ambulances and Sheriff Eduardo Norman's truck. The sheriff was a hard man in his 60s, a Vietnam veteran who'd seen his share of violence. But even he stopped dead when he saw the inside of the diner through the broken window. "Mother of God," he whispered. Then, louder, "Jordan, get every EMT in the county here now. And call the state police. Tell them we have a situation." Over the next hour, the scene descended into controlled chaos. EMTs worked on the bikers, many of whom were being loaded into ambulances with serious injuries. None were dead. Jordan noted that with surprise. With this level of violence, he'd expected bodies. Instead, it was just broken bones, concussions, lacerations. Like whoever did this had known exactly how much force to use. Sheriff Norman interviewed Sharon first. She told him everything. How the bikers had taken over the diner, how Terrence Bauer had assaulted her, how Garrett had defended her. Her voice never wavered. She showed him the bruises on her throat, the mark where she'd been slapped. Other witnesses were being rounded up, the families who'd fled, Norman Cochran who'd watched from across the street, Cassie Sellers who'd called 911 after seeing bikers climbing out of windows. Then Norman sat down across from Garrett in the back of a patrol car. Garrett's hands were still cuffed, but he sat relaxed, his one good eye watching the sheriff calmly. "You want to tell me what happened, Garrett?" "They came into my diner, took it over, assaulted my sister. I stopped them." "You stopped 50 bikers? By yourself?" "Yes, sir." Norman leaned back, studying him. "I did some checking after those boys first showed up in town. Made some calls to Fort Bragg. Found out Staff Sergeant Garrett McGee was one hell of a soldier. Combat instructor. Hand-to-hand specialist. 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star. Classified deployments I couldn't even get details on." He paused. "That you?" Used to be. Used to be," Norman echoed. "What do you think I should do with you, Garrett? You put 50 men in the hospital. That's not self-defense. That's a war zone." "Sheriff," Garrett said quietly. "Respectfully, I didn't start this. They came to my place, threatened my customers, assaulted my sister. I defended her. If that's a crime, then charge me." Norman was quiet for a long moment, watching ambulances load up bikers and drive away with sirens wailing. Finally, he reached over and unlocked Garrett's cuffs. "Here's how this is going to go," Norman said. "You're going to the hospital to get checked out. Then you're going to give a statement to the state police. Then you're going to go home and stay there while we sort this mess out." He met Garrett's eyes. "I don't know if you were right or wrong tonight, Garrett, but I know those boys have been terrorizing this town for weeks, and nobody's been able to stop them. So I'm going to let the lawyers and investigators figure out what charges, if any, should be filed. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get yourself patched up. And Garrett," Norman stood to leave, then looked back. "Thank you. For protecting your sister. For protecting this town. Even if I have to arrest you tomorrow, thank you." The hospital was chaos. Garrett was put in a room at the end of the emergency wing, away from the bikers who filled every other available space. A doctor named Elizabeth Stanton examined him, her face carefully neutral as she cataloged his injuries. 3 broken ribs, a fractured shoulder, multiple lacerations, severe bruising, and knuckles so torn up she wasn't sure he'd regain full dexterity. "You need to stay overnight for observation," she said. "No, Mr. McGee. My sister's alone at home. I'm not staying." Dr. Stanton sighed, but didn't argue. She stitched his eyebrow, wrapped his ribs, put his shoulder in a brace, and bandaged his hands. "Try not to use these for a week. No punching anything." Garrett almost smiled. "I'll do my best." Sharon was waiting outside with Jordan McIntyre. The deputy had insisted on driving them home. More protection than escort, Garrett suspected. As they walked through the ER, Garrett passed rooms filled with Devil's disciples. Some glared at him. Some looked away. Randolph Hall, his face a mass of bandages, just stared with cold, hateful eyes that promised this wasn't over. At home, a small house 3 blocks from the diner, Sharon made tea while Garrett sat at the kitchen table, too wired to sleep. Jordan stayed with them, parked outside in his patrol car, just in case. Through the window, Garrett could see him sitting there, a silent guardian. "I'm sorry," Sharon said finally, setting a mug in front of him. "For what?" "For slapping that man. For causing all this." Garrett looked at his sister, his baby sister, who'd survived an abusive marriage, who'd rebuilt her life from nothing, who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a world where men like Terrence Bauer felt entitled to touch her. He reached across the table and took her unbandaged hand. "You didn't cause anything," he said firmly. "They did. Every choice they made led to tonight. Not you. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I thought they were going to kill you. 50 of them, Garrett. I've never been so scared in my life. I know, but I'm still here. We're both still here. And that's what matters. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, drinking tea, while outside Jordan McIntyre kept watch and the town of Silver Ridge began to process what had happened at the diner. Word was spreading fast. Garrett heard his phone buzzing with messages from people he barely knew. Norman Cochran, Cassie Sellers, other townsfolk expressing support, shocked gratitude. Some were calling him a hero. Others were calling him a monster. Garrett didn't feel like either. He felt tired. He felt the old weight settling back onto his shoulders, the weight he'd thought he'd shed when he left the army. He'd killed men in combat, had done terrible things in the name of his country, and when he'd finally gotten out, he'd promised himself he'd never be that person again. Tonight he'd broken that promise. And the worst part was, he didn't regret it. Around 3 in the morning, Garrett finally dozed off in his chair. He dreamed of Kandahar, of Fallujah, of the faces of men he'd killed. He dreamed of Sharon's face when Terrence grabbed her throat. He dreamed of Randolph Hall's cold eyes, promising revenge. He woke to his phone ringing at 7 a.m. It was Sheriff Norman. Garrett, we need to talk. The state police are here, and they want a statement. Plus, we've got a complication. What kind of complication? The devil's disciples are lawyering up. They're claiming you attacked them unprovoked. That they were just customers who got assaulted by a violent lunatic with a military background. They've already got a hotshot attorney named Cameron Bliss from Billings talking about pressing charges. Garrett sat up, his ribs screaming in protest. They attacked my sister. I know, and we've got witnesses who'll say that. But, Garrett, Norman hesitated. 50 men in the hospital, some with permanent injuries. The DA's getting pressure to charge you with aggravated assault at minimum. Maybe attempted murder for a few of the worst cases. When do they want me? Now. Can you come down to the station? On my way. Sharon insisted on coming with him. They drove past the diner. Yellow police tape surrounded it, and through the broken windows Garrett could see crime scene technicians photographing evidence. His life's work, his sanctuary, now a crime scene. At the police station, state police investigators grilled him for 3 hours. They recorded everything, took photos of his injuries, asked him to demonstrate exactly how he'd fought. Garrett told them the truth. He defended his sister and himself against 50 violent attackers. He'd used the minimal force necessary to neutralize the threats. He'd locked the door to prevent them from escaping and hurting anyone else in town. The lead investigator, a hard-eyed woman named Christy Bruce, didn't look convinced. Minimal force, she repeated. Mr. McGee, you put 50 men in the hospital. Some of them may never walk right again. You really expect us to believe that's minimal force? I expect you to believe that if I'd wanted to kill them, they'd be dead, Garrett said flatly. Every man in that diner is alive because I showed restraint. Bruce exchanged glances with her partner. They clearly didn't know what to do with him. The interview ended without charges, but Bruce made it clear this wasn't over. Don't leave town, Mr. McGee. We'll be in touch. Outside, Sharon was waiting with Norman Cochran and a half-dozen other townsfolk. They applauded when Garrett emerged, which made him deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who defended his sister. Town council wants to meet with you, Norman said. They're talking about giving you some kind of commendation. I don't want a commendation. I want this to go away. It's not going to go away, son, Norman said gently. What you did last night, that's going to echo for a long time. He was right. Over the next few days, the story exploded. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then national. Green Beret defeats 50 bikers in small-town diner brawl ran on CNN. Fox News had a segment about whether his actions were justified. The internet turned him into a meme. Photos of the wrecked diner with captions like, when you're not locked in with them, they're locked in with you. Garrett hated all of it. He stayed home, ignored the reporters camped outside, and waited for the legal hammer to fall. Sharon went back to work. The diner was still a crime scene, so she got a temporary job at Cassie's convenience store. Jordan McIntyre stopped by daily, ostensibly to check on them, but really to make sure no bikers came looking for revenge. Because the devil's disciples weren't done. Not by a long shot. Cameron Bliss was everything Garrett despised in a person: slick, calculating, and morally flexible. The attorney had made a name for himself defending criminals in Montana, and now he'd taken on the devil's disciples as clients. He held a press conference outside the Billings courthouse, flanked by Randolph Hall, face still bandaged, and several other injured bikers in wheelchairs and casts. "My clients are victims of an unprovoked, savage attack," Bliss declared, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. "They went to the Silver Ridge Diner for a meal, and they were brutally assaulted by a trained killer. Garrett McGee is a dangerous individual with military combat training who used excessive, deadly force against unarmed civilians. We are filing a civil lawsuit for damages and urging the district attorney to press criminal charges." The cameras ate it up. Garrett watched from his living room, Sharon beside him, and felt his jaw clench. Randolph Hall looked directly into the camera, his eyes cold as winter, and said, "Garrett McGee thinks he's above the law because he was in the military. But he's not. He's just a thug who attacked 50 innocent people, and he's going to pay for what he did." "Innocent," Sharon spat. "They're calling themselves innocent." The phone rang. It was an attorney named Lucia Fitzpatrick from Helena, a civil rights lawyer who'd been following the case. "Mr. McGee, I'd like to represent you. Pro bono. What those bikers did to you and your sister is unconscionable, and I don't believe anyone should profit from it." Garrett accepted. He didn't have much choice. Over the next week, the legal maneuvering began. Cameron Bliss filed a $10 million lawsuit against Garrett, claiming his clients had suffered physical, emotional, and financial damages. The district attorney, under pressure from Bliss and some state politicians who were friendly with motorcycle clubs, announced he was seriously considering criminal charges. Meanwhile, Lucia Fitzpatrick went on the offensive. She filed countersuit on behalf of Garrett and Sharon, claiming assault, unlawful imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She gathered statements from every witness who'd been in the diner that night, got medical reports on Sharon's injuries, and obtained police records showing the devil's disciples' criminal history. "This is going to get ugly," Lucia warned Garrett during a meeting at her office. "Cameron Bliss is good at what he does, and he's going to paint you as a dangerous vigilante. We need to be prepared for anything." "I am," Garrett said quietly. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next. 3 nights after the press conference, Garrett woke to the sound of breaking glass. He rolled out of bed, his ribs protesting, and grabbed the baseball bat he'd started keeping by his nightstand. Downstairs, he found his living room window shattered and a brick sitting in the middle of the floor. Attached to it was a note: "You're dead, Army. Watch your back." Jordan McIntyre came within minutes of Garrett's 911 call, lights off to avoid alerting whoever had thrown the brick. But they were long gone. All that remained was the threat. "I'm putting a patrol on your house," Jordan said. "Full time. This is escalating." "You don't have the manpower for that," Garrett pointed out. "Then I'll do it myself. Off duty if I have to." Jordan met his eyes. "Those boys aren't going to let this go, Garrett. They want revenge, and they're not going to stop until they get it." Garrett nodded slowly. He'd known this would happen, had prepared for it in his way. The old habits were coming back, checking sight lines, noting escape routes, sleeping light, and waking at the slightest sound. He was becoming the soldier again, whether he wanted to or not. The next morning, Sharon found a dead rat nailed to the diner's back door. The message was clear. They knew where she worked, where she was vulnerable. Garrett wanted to pull her out of Silver Ridge entirely, send her somewhere safe, but Sharon refused. "I already ran from Dave," she said, her voice hard. "I'm not running from them. This is my home now, Garrett. Our home. And I'm not giving it up." So they stayed, and waited, and prepared for the next move in a game they'd never wanted to play. That move came 2 days later, and it was far worse than either of them expected. Garrett was at the police station giving another statement to the state investigators when his phone rang. It was Cassie Sellers, and she was screaming. "Garrett, they took her. They took Sharon." The phone nearly slipped from his hands. "What? Who took her?" "The bikers." A van pulled up outside the store. 5 or 6 of them grabbed her and threw her inside. "I tried to stop them, but..." Cassie's voice broke into sobs. Garrett was already running for the door. Jordan McIntyre intercepted him, having heard Cassie's screams through the phone. "Garrett, wait. We need to do this right. Let us. Get out of my way, Jordan. Garrett, if you go after them like this, you'll make everything worse. Let us handle it. We'll get Sharon back, I promise." Garrett stopped, breathing hard, his vision tinged with red. Every instinct screamed at him to hunt those men down and tear them apart. But Jordan was right. If he went vigilante now, he'd lose everything. His freedom, his case, any chance at a legitimate defense. And Sharon would still be in danger. "How long?" Garrett asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Give us 1 hour. If we haven't found her by then." Jordan trailed off, but his meaning was clear. After 1 hour, he wouldn't stop Garrett from doing what needed to be done. Sheriff Norman was already mobilizing every officer in the county. They put out an APB on the van, set up roadblocks, called in the state police. Lucia Fitzpatrick filed emergency motions for restraining orders. Cameron Bliss, when reached for comment, claimed his clients had nothing to do with any kidnapping. 45 minutes later, they found the van abandoned on a logging road 15 miles outside town. Sharon wasn't inside, but there was blood. Not much, just a few drops on the floor. And another note, "We have your sister, Army. Come to the Morrison place alone if you want to see her again. You've got until midnight." It was 6 p.m. 6 hours until midnight. 6 hours to save Sharon or watch her disappear forever. Sheriff Norman looked at Garrett across the conference table in the station's back room. Around them sat Jordan McIntyre, Melanie Cruz, Lucia Fitzpatrick, and 2 state police detectives. Outside, a tactical team was gearing up for a potential rescue operation at the Morrison property, the old lake house that the Devil's disciples had turned into their clubhouse. "We can't let you go in there alone," Norman said. "It's suicide. They'll kill you the second you walk through the door." "Maybe," Garrett agreed. "But if you send in a SWAT team, they'll kill Sharon first. This is a hostage situation, Sheriff. You know the statistics. Hostages don't usually survive when tactical teams breach. And they definitely don't survive when untrained civilians try to be heroes." One of the state detectives, Christy Bruce, interjected. "Mr. McGee, I understand you're worried about your sister, but this is not a DIY operation. These men are dangerous criminals." Garrett almost laughed at that. Dangerous criminals. He'd fought actual terrorists, insurgents who would strap bombs to children and blow up markets. The Devil's disciples were playground bullies with motorcycles. But he kept that thought to himself. "What's your plan then? Surround the property and negotiate?" "Standard hostage protocols," Norman confirmed. "We establish communication. We negotiate. We wait for an opening. And while you're negotiating, they're hurting my sister." Garrett stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Sheriff. But Sharon's been through enough. I'm not letting her suffer because we're following protocols." "Garrett, sit down," Lucia said firmly. "If you walk out that door and go to the Morrison place, you're committing a crime. Vigilantism. I can't defend that." "Then don't." He walked out before anyone could stop him. Jordan called after him, but Garrett didn't look back. He had 6 hours to prepare, and he wasn't going to waste them arguing. At home, Garrett changed into dark clothing, jeans, a black shirt, boots with good traction. He taped his broken ribs, popped 4 ibuprofen for the pain, and wrapped his damaged hands in athletic tape. In the garage, he pulled down a footlocker he hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside were things from his Army days. Night vision goggles, a tactical vest, and a few other items that weren't strictly legal for civilians to own. He took what he needed and left the rest. Then he sat at his kitchen table and made a plan. The Morrison property was 10 acres on Silver Lake, accessible by a single dirt road. The main house was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, probably 5 or 6 rooms. Behind it stood an old barn that the bikers had converted into a garage for their motorcycles. Garrett had driven past it once, back when the Morrisons still owned it, before they'd sold to the Devil's disciples and moved to Florida. He pulled up satellite images on his laptop. The property was surrounded by forest on 3 sides, with a lake on the 4th. Good for concealment, bad for escape routes. There'd be lookouts, probably armed. The main house would be where they kept Sharon, somewhere visible, where they could watch her and use her as leverage if the cops showed up. The question was how many bikers were there. 50 had been at the diner, but some were still hospitalized. Garrett estimated maybe 30 or 35 active members. Even wounded, that was significant numbers. But numbers didn't matter if you had surprise and superior tactics. At 10 p.m., Garrett loaded his gear into his truck and drove towards Silver Lake. He parked 2 miles from the Morrison property in a turnoff hidden by trees and hiked the rest of the way through the forest. The night was clear and cold, with a half-moon providing decent visibility. He moved slowly, carefully, using his old infantry training to avoid making noise. 15 minutes later, he reached the tree line overlooking the property. He'd been right about the lookouts. 2 bikers sat on the porch, smoking cigarettes and drinking beer. More bikes were parked in front of the barn, at least 20 of them. Lights blazed in the main house's windows. Through one window on the second floor, Garrett saw shadows moving. He pulled out a small pair of binoculars and scanned the house systematically. First floor, living room with several bikers watching TV, kitchen with more drinking and playing cards. Second floor, 2 bedrooms visible. In one, he saw Sharon tied to a chair, Terrence Bauer standing over her. Garrett's hands tightened on the binoculars. Sharon looked terrified but unharmed, though he could see bruises forming on her face. Terrence was talking to her, gesturing, clearly enjoying her fear. Randolph Hall entered the room, spoke to Terrence, then looked out the window as if searching for Garrett. They were expecting him. Of course they were. This whole thing was a trap designed to lure him in and finish what they'd started at the diner. The only question was whether they planned to kill him outright or make it look like self-defense. Either way, Cameron Bliss would spin it in their favor. Garrett checked his watch, 11:20 p.m., 40 minutes until midnight. The police would be setting up a perimeter by now, but they'd stay back, following protocols, waiting for him to either show up or for the bikers to make contact. They wouldn't breach unless absolutely necessary, which meant Garrett was on his own, just the way he preferred it. He circled around to the lake side of the property, moving through the trees like a ghost. This was what he'd been trained for: infiltration, close-quarters combat, hostage rescue. The army had spent millions of dollars turning him into a weapon, and now he was going to use that training for the one thing that truly mattered: saving his sister. At the water's edge, Garrett paused. The back of the house faced the lake, with a deck and sliding glass doors leading into what looked like a dining room. One biker stood guard there, his attention focused on his phone rather than his surroundings. Sloppy, arrogant, exactly what Garrett had expected from criminals who thought themselves untouchable. Garrett picked up a stone and threw it into the water 30 feet away. The splash was quiet but distinct. The guard's head snapped up, and he walked toward the sound, hand moving to the pistol at his waist. As he passed within 5 feet of Garrett's position, Garrett moved. One hand clamped over the guard's mouth. The other drove a fist into the man's kidney, then wrapped around his throat in a blood choke. The guard struggled for maybe 5 seconds before going limp. Garrett lowered him quietly to the ground, took his pistol, a Glock 19, and checked the magazine. 15 rounds. Good enough. He moved to the back door and tested it. Locked, but it was a simple deadbolt. Garrett pulled out a small tension wrench and pick from his vest, tools he'd kept from his army days for situations exactly like this, and had it open in under a minute. He slipped inside, closing the door silently behind him. The dining room was empty. Voices came from the living room, multiple men arguing about something. Garrett moved along the wall, staying low, the Glock up and ready. He passed through the kitchen, where 2 bikers sat at a table counting money. They didn't notice him in the shadows. A staircase led to the second floor. Garrett took the steps slowly, testing each one for creaks, keeping his weight distributed. At the top, a hallway stretched left and right. The room where he'd seen Sharon was to the right, second door. Between him and that door stood another guard, Brent Henderson, his head still bandaged from the diner fight. Brent was looking at his phone, earbuds in, completely oblivious. Garrett crossed the hallway in 3 silent steps, grabbed Brent by the collar, and slammed him face first into the wall. Brent went down without a sound. Garrett zip-tied his hands and feet, stuffed a gag in his mouth, and dragged him into a bathroom. 2 down. At Sharon's door, Garrett paused and listened. Terrence's voice came through. Should have just stayed in Billings. None of this would have happened. But no. When your brother had to play hero. Sharon's voice, scared but defiant. You're going to pay for this. All of you. Terrence laughed. We're not the ones who are going to pay, sweetheart. Your brother's walking into a trap. By midnight, he'll be dead, and everyone will know he died attacking innocent people trying to defend their home. Cameron Bliss has it all figured out. You're insane. No, we're smart. Your brother humiliated the devil's disciples. Made us look weak. We can't let that stand. So we're going to kill him, and then maybe we'll let you go. If you behave. Garrett had heard enough. He tested the doorknob. Unlocked. He counted to 3, then kicked it open and went in fast and low. Terrence spun around, fumbling for a gun on a nearby table. Garrett shot him twice in the chest, center mass, just like they taught him. Terrence went down hard. Sharon screamed through her gag. Garrett crossed to her, pulled the gag free, and started cutting her zip ties with a knife. Garrett, we're leaving. Now, can you walk? Yes, but then let's go. He heard shouts from downstairs. The gunshots had alerted everyone. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. Garrett pushed Sharon toward the window. Out onto the roof. Move. Sharon climbed out onto the second-story roof while Garrett covered the door. The first biker threw as a man he didn't recognize didn't matter. Garrett fired once, hitting him in the leg, and the biker went down screaming. Another push passed, firing wildly. Garrett dropped, felt bullets tear through the air above him, and returned fire with controlled shots. One hit the biker's shoulder, spinning him around. He fell back into the hallway. Garrett was out of time. He turned and dove through the window, rolling on impact with the roof, his broken ribs screaming. Sharon grabbed his arm and helped him up. Below, bikers were pouring out of the house, some with guns, all of them shouting. Jump, Garrett yelled, pulling Sharon toward the edge of the roof above the deck. It was a 12-foot drop into the lake. Not great, but better than the alternative. They jumped together. The cold water hit like a hammer, driving the air from Garrett's lungs. His ribs felt like they were tearing apart. He surfaced, grabbed Sharon, and started swimming toward the far shore. Behind them, bikers were shooting, bullets zipping into the water, but it was dark and they were moving targets. Most of the shots went wide. They made it to the tree line on the far side of the lake, maybe 200 yards from the house. Garrett pulled Sharon into the forest, and they ran. He heard engines roaring to life. Motorcycles, probably, though some sounded like trucks. They'd be coming after them, hunting them through the woods. Can't keep running, Sharon gasped. She was shaking, half from cold and half from shock. We don't have to. Garrett pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, he said, "This is Garrett McGee. I'm at the Morrison property on Silver Lake. Shots fired. Multiple armed suspects. Hostage situation resolved. Send everyone you have." He hung up before the operator could respond. Sirens were already wailing in the distance. The police had been waiting for something like this. Sheriff Norman would bring the hammer down now. Probably had SWAT teams moving into position already. Garrett and Sharon hid in a dense thicket while motorcycle headlights swept through the trees around them. The bikers were close, very close, but the forest was dark and they were making too much noise to effectively track anyone. After 5 minutes that felt like hours, the sounds of engines started to fade, replaced by sirens and shouted police commands. Morrison property, this is Sheriff Norman. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up. Gunshots rang out. The bikers were firing at the police. Bad move. That gave Norman everything he needed to bring in the tactical team. Within minutes, the night exploded with flashbangs and tear gas. Garrett heard the familiar sounds of a building being breached, shouted commands, more gunshots, and then gradually silence. 20 minutes later, Jordan McIntyre found them. He had a thermal scope and a team of deputies, and when he saw Garrett and Sharon huddled under a pine tree, soaking wet and shivering, his face went pale with relief. "Jesus, Garrett, you actually did it. Is it over?" Sharon asked. "It's over," Jordan confirmed. "We got 32 of them. Some surrendered, Some had to be convinced. Randolph Hall tried to run and got shot in the leg by state police. Terrence Bauer's dead. You kill him. Garrett nodded. Self-defense. He was threatening Sharon with a gun. Jordan absorbed that. There's going to be a full investigation. FBI's already on the way. This whole thing, it's going to be a circus. Let it, Garrett said. He stood up, wincing, and helped Sharon to her feet. As long as my sister's safe, I don't care what happens to me. The aftermath of the Morrison property raid was indeed a circus. The FBI took over the investigation, discovering that the Devil's Disciples weren't just a motorcycle club. They were a criminal enterprise trafficking drugs across state lines, laundering money through legitimate businesses, and running protection rackets in towns across Montana and Wyoming. The raid had been a gold mine of evidence. Drugs, illegal weapons, financial records, and testimony from lower-level members willing to flip on leadership in exchange for reduced sentences. Randolph Hall and the other top members faced federal RICO charges. Cameron Bliss, their slick attorney, found himself under investigation for possible obstruction of justice after evidence emerged suggesting he'd known about the kidnapping plot. The civil lawsuit against Garrett was quietly dropped. Garrett himself faced a different kind of legal battle. The shooting of Terrence Bauer was ruled self-defense after ballistic evidence, and Sharon's testimony made it clear Terrence had been armed and threatening her when Garrett entered the room. But there were still questions about how Garrett had gotten onto the property, whether he'd acted as a vigilante, and whether his actions had been justified or excessive. The court of public opinion had already made its decision, though. Garrett McGee was a hero, protecting his sister, taking down a criminal enterprise, standing up to 50 bikers. The story had everything. National news ran with it. Social media exploded with support. Someone started a legal defense fund that raised over $200,000 in 3 days. Garrett hated every second of it. He wanted to go back to his quiet life, running his diner, drinking coffee with Norman Cochran in the mornings. But that life was gone, destroyed the moment Randolph Hall walked through his door. He'd been forced back into being the soldier, the fighter, the man he'd tried so hard to bury. And he didn't know if he could put that man back in a box again. 2 weeks after the Morrison raid, the district attorney made his decision. Standing on the courthouse steps with cameras recording every word, DA Melanie Cruz announced that no charges would be filed against Garrett McGee. After careful review of all evidence and testimony, she said, "It is clear that Mr. McGee acted in defense of himself and his sister when faced with an immediate and credible threat. While we don't endorse vigilante justice, we recognize that Mr. McGee was placed in an impossible situation by the criminal actions of the Devil's Disciples Motorcycle Club. This office will not prosecute someone for protecting their family." The crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. Garrett, standing off to the side with Lucia Fitzpatrick, felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just exhaustion. "It's over," Lucia said, squeezing his arm. "You can go home now." But was it really over? As Garrett scanned the crowd, he saw TV cameras, reporters, people holding signs with his name. One sign read, "Garrett McGee for Sheriff." Another said, "American Hero." They'd turned him into a symbol, and symbols were never free. That night, Garrett sat in his empty diner with Sharon. The insurance had paid for repairs, but the place felt different now. Smaller, less safe. The memories of what happened here would never fade. Sharon felt it too. He could see it in the way she kept glancing at the spot where Terrence had grabbed her. "We could sell," Garrett said quietly. "Start over somewhere else." Sharon was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. Then she shook her head. "No, they don't get to take this from us. We built something here, Garrett. A life. A home. If we run, they win. They're in prison, Sharon. They already lost. Did they? Or did we just prove their point? That violence is the only thing that matters, that the strongest person wins." She looked at him with eyes full of pain and wisdom she hadn't had before. "I don't want to live in that world, Garrett. I don't want to believe that the only way to be safe is to be more violent than everyone else." "Then what do you want?" "I want to rebuild. Not just the diner, but us. Our lives. I want to prove that we're more than what happened here. That we can heal, move forward, be something other than victims or fighters." Garrett nodded slowly. She was right, of course. She was always right. But he wasn't sure he knew how to be anything other than what he was. A soldier without a war, a protector without anyone to protect, now that the threat was neutralized. Over the next few months, they did rebuild. The diner reopened with a small ceremony attended by most of Silver Ridge. Norman Cochran was first in line for coffee. Jordan McIntyre hung a small plaque by the door, Silver Ridge Diner, where heroes are made. Garrett tried to take it down 3 times before Sharon made him leave it. Business was better than ever. People drove from neighboring towns just to eat at the place where it happened. They wanted to meet Garrett, shake his hand, hear the story firsthand. He hated it, but endured it because the extra income meant Sharon could finally afford to go back to school full-time. She enrolled in an online nursing program, studying late into the night at the counter while Garrett cleaned and prepped for the next day. The Devil's Disciples trial became a national sensation. Randolph Hall and 6 lieutenants were convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in federal prison. Smaller members took plea deals, testimony implicating the club in crimes dating back 15 years. The club itself was officially disbanded and designated a criminal organization, its assets seized and sold at auction. Garrett didn't attend any of it. He'd said everything he needed to say in his deposition. Watching Randolph Hall get sentenced wouldn't heal anything. It would just be another chapter in a story he wanted close. But closure didn't come easy. 6 months after the diner fight, Garrett woke up screaming. Sharon rushed into his room to find him tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, hyperventilating. PTSD. The Army doctors had told him it might come back if he ever got into combat again. They'd been right. Sharon insisted he see someone. Garrett resisted until she gave him an ultimatum. Get help or she'd move out. She couldn't watch him destroy himself, she said. She'd done that with Dave, and she wouldn't do it again. So Garrett started seeing Dr. Catherine Keith, a VA psychologist in Billings who specialized in combat veterans. Twice a week, he drove 90 minutes each way to sit in her office and talk about things he'd spent years not thinking about. It was harder than any fight he'd ever been in. You've been a soldier most of your adult life, Dr. Keith told him during one session. You defined yourself by that identity. And when you try to leave it behind, circumstances forced you back into it. Now you're stuck between 2 worlds, the man you were and the man you want to be. That's a difficult place to inhabit. So what do? You accept that both men are you. The soldier isn't a separate person you can lock away. He's part of who you are and always will be. The question isn't how to bury him. It's how to integrate him into the life you want to build. Integration. It was a nice theory. But Garrett didn't know how to integrate a man who'd killed people, who'd fought 50 bikers and won, who still woke up some nights with his hands formed into fists, ready to strike at threats that didn't exist. Sharon helped, though. She was patient with his bad days, firm on his good ones, refusing to let him wallow or retreat into himself. She dragged him to town events, made him participate in the community. Slowly, grudgingly, Garrett found himself becoming part of Silver Ridge in a way he hadn't been before. Norman Cochran recruited him to help with the VFW's annual fundraiser. Cassie Sellers asked him to speak at her son's Boy Scout troop about military service. Jordan McIntyre invited him to join the volunteer fire department. Bit by bit, Garrett found new ways to define himself beyond what had happened to the diner. A year after the fight, something unexpected happened. Jordan McIntyre pulled up to the diner during the morning rush and walked in with Sheriff Norman. They sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and then Norman slid an envelope across to Garrett. What's this? Open it. Inside was an official letter from the Montana governor's office. Garrett scanned it once, then again, not sure he was reading it correctly. They're giving you a civilian medal of valor, Norman explained, for your actions protecting Sharon and standing up to a criminal organization. Governor wants to present it at a ceremony in Helena next month. Garrett put the letter down. I don't want a medal. Tough. You're getting one anyway. Norman's expression softened. Garrett, I know you don't see yourself as a hero, but this town does. This state does. What you did mattered. It saved lives, took down bad people, showed everyone that good people don't have to be victims. Let them honor that. He's right, Jordan added. Besides, Sharon already RSVP'd for both of you. Garrett looked through the kitchen window where Sharon was flipping pancakes, a slight smile on her face. She'd been in on this. Fine, he muttered, but I'm not making a speech. He ended up making a speech. Standing on a stage in Helena in front of cameras and dignitaries, Garrett accepted the medal and said words that surprised even himself. I'm not a hero, he began, and the audience murmured. Heroes are people who rush into burning buildings or dive into rivers to save strangers. I'm just a brother who protected his sister. Any of you would have done the same in my position. The real heroism wasn't in the fight. It was in what came after. My sister Sharon, who survived assault and kidnapping and came back stronger. The people of Silver Ridge, who stood by us when things got hard. Sheriff Norman and his deputies, who risked their lives taking down a criminal organization. Those are the heroes. I was just doing what needed to be done. And I'd do it again every single time if it meant keeping the people I love safe. The applause was deafening. Garrett stepped off the stage and found Sharon waiting, tears streaming down her face. I'm proud of you, she whispered, hugging him tight. So proud. I'm proud of you too, he replied. And he meant it. Sharon had survived hell and come out the other side, still believing in goodness, still fighting for a better life. If that wasn't heroism, Garrett didn't know what was. 2 years after the diner fight, life had found a new normal. The Silver Ridge Diner thrived, now employing 3 additional staff members including Brooke Murray, a young single mother who reminded Garrett a bit of Sharon. Determined, hard-working, deserving of a chance. Sharon graduated with her nursing degree and got a job at the county hospital, though she still helped at the diner on weekends. Norman Cochran still came for coffee every morning, now bringing his grandson who wanted to hear stories about the war hero. Garrett's nightmares became less frequent. The therapy helped. So did the routine, the community, the sense of purpose that came from building something with his sister. He'd never be free of his past. Neither the army years nor the diner fight, but he'd learned to carry that past without letting it define him. Sometimes, late at night, when the diner was closed and he was alone with his thoughts, Garrett would stand where it had all happened, where 50 bikers had thought they could terrorize his family and take what wasn't theirs, where he'd been forced to become the soldier again, to use every terrible skill he'd learned in service to his country. He didn't regret it. That was the truth he'd finally accepted. Given the same circumstances, he'd make the same choices. He'd lock that door again. He'd fight again. He'd protect Sharon and everyone else he loved with everything he had. Consequences be damned. But he hoped, deeply, sincerely hoped, that he'd never have to. On a warm September evening, Garrett was closing up when Jordan McIntyre walked in. He'd been promoted to sheriff after Eduardo Norman retired, and he wore the responsibility well. Got some news, Jordan said, sliding onto a stool. Good or bad? Depends on your perspective. Randolph Hall died in prison 2 days ago. Heart attack. Garrett absorbed that. He waited for something, satisfaction, relief, closure. But all he felt was tired. Good riddance. Yeah. Jordan paused, then pulled out a folded piece of paper. He left this. Prison chaplain sent it to me, asked that I give it to you. Garrett unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten letter, the writing shaky. McGee, I've had 2 years to think about what happened. 2 years in a cell, watching my club destroyed, my brothers scattered or dead. 2 years to realize that I fucked up that night in your diner. We thought we were tough. We thought numbers and reputation made us untouchable. We thought we could take whatever we wanted, your diner, your sister, your respect. We were wrong. You showed us what real strength looks like. Not in numbers or weapons or criminal enterprises, but in a man willing to stand alone against 50 others to protect someone he loved. That's power we never understood. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm just saying I understand now why we lost. You were fighting for something real. We were just fighting to fight. You won. Not just the battle, but the war. Your sister's alive and well. Your town's safer. Your life means something. Mine? Mine into the night, I walked into your diner. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Randolph Hall. Garrett read it twice, then handed it to Jordan. The deputy scanned it and whistled low. Hell of a thing. You believe it. Does it matter? Garrett replied, "He's dead. The club's gone. It's over." "Is it?" Jordan asked quietly. "Over for you, I mean." Garrett thought about that. Was it over? Could it ever really be over when you'd done the things he'd done, seen the things he'd seen? The diner fight was just one chapter in a long story of violence that stretched back to his first deployment 18 years ago. One day that story would end, but not today. Maybe not ever. But he also thought about Sharon, about to start her first shift at the hospital. About Norman Cochran's grandson asking to hear stories. About Brooke Murray working hard to give her daughter a better life. About the community he'd found in Silver Ridge, the people who'd stood by him when he needed them most. "Yeah," Garrett said finally. "It's over." Jordan nodded, satisfied with that answer, even if Garrett wasn't entirely sure it was true. They sat together in the quiet diner, two men who'd seen darkness and chosen to stand against it, sharing coffee as the sun set over Silver Ridge. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, the only sound in the empty room. And outside, the town moved forward into whatever came next, a little bit safer, because one man had decided that some lines couldn't be crossed, some people couldn't be allowed to hurt the innocent, and some fights, no matter how impossible they seemed, had to be fought. The Silver Ridge Diner would open again tomorrow morning. Norman Cochran would come for coffee. Life would continue, and Garrett McGee, Green Beret veteran, hand-to-hand combat instructor, and just a man trying to protect his family, would be there behind the counter, ready to serve breakfast and defend peace in equal measure. Because that's what heroes did. Not the ones in stories, but the real ones. The ones who showed up every day, did the work, protected what mattered, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to live quiet lives with the people they loved. 50 bikers had learned that lesson the hard way, and Garrett hoped no one else would ever need to learn it again.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.